The Grand Council chamber of the Zephyrian Empire stretched across 3 kilometers of polished crystal floors. Representatives from 47 different species sat in their designated sections, each arranged according to their species' hierarchy within the Empire. The Zephyrians, tall, blue-skinned beings with 4 arms and glowing silver eyes, occupied the highest tier. Below them sat the warrior races, then the merchant classes, and, finally, at the very bottom, the newest members of the Empire. Captain Sarah Chun stood alone in the center of the vast chamber, her simple human military uniform looking plain against the elaborate robes and armor of the alien representatives. She was the only human present, and every eye in the chamber was fixed on her small figure. The weight of their collective stare should have been crushing, but Sarah stood straight, her hands clasped behind her back, waiting. High Counselor Vextar rose from his throne-like seat, his 4 arms spreading wide in a gesture of authority. His voice echoed through the chamber's advanced acoustic system, reaching every corner with perfect clarity. Human representative, Vextar began, his tone dripping with condescension. You stand before this council accused of the most serious crime imaginable. Your species has committed an act of unprovoked aggression against the peaceful Carillion mining collective. 17 mining vessels were destroyed. 3,000 innocent beings lost their lives. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Sarah could hear the various alien languages mixing together, but the universal translators built into her suit converted the general sentiment. They were all calling for justice. They wanted blood. Vextar continued, his silver eyes glowing brighter with each word. The evidence is clear. Human military vessels fired upon unarmed civilian miners. This barbaric attack violated every law of civilized space. It broke the sacred accords that have kept peace in our galaxy for 800 years. Sarah remained silent, though her jaw tightened slightly. She had requested this audience, but protocol demanded she wait until formally asked to speak. The Carillion survivors identified human ships by their unique energy signatures, added Counselor Zelnath, an insect-like being from the 4th tier. Their sensor logs show clear evidence of Earth-manufactured weapons. There could be no doubt about who committed this atrocity. More voices joined in from around the chamber. Sarah heard calls for immediate action, demands for reparations, and worse. Some were calling for humanity to be expelled from the Empire entirely. Others wanted Earth itself to be placed under military occupation. Furthermore, Vextar's voice rose above the others. This attack represents exactly the kind of primitive violence we expected from a species so recently emerged from their home system. Humans have been part of our empire for only 23 standard years. In that short time, they have shown themselves to be aggressive, unpredictable, and clearly unable to adapt to civilized behavior. The chamber erupted in agreement. Species after species stood to voice their support for punishment. The Vorlian Confederation demanded immediate military action. The Altarian Trade Union called for complete economic isolation of human space. Even some of the newer member species, eager to distance themselves from humanity's apparent crimes, added their voices to the chorus. Sarah watched it all with calm eyes. She had expected this reaction. The evidence against humanity did look damning, and she knew that most of these beings had never trusted her species anyway. Humans were newcomers in a galaxy where some civilizations had been part of the Empire for thousands of years. The noise in the chamber gradually died down as Vextar raised all 4 of his arms for silence. When quiet returned, he fixed his glowing gaze on Sarah. Captain Chun, he said formally, you requested this audience to respond to these charges. The Council will now hear what defense humanity can possibly offer for such an inexcusable act of violence. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. She stepped forward, her boots clicking against the crystal floor. The sound echoed in the sudden silence that had fallen over the chamber. Honored counselors, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. I stand before you today not to offer excuses or denials. I come here to speak the truth, even though that truth may be difficult for this assembly to hear. Some of the representatives shifted uncomfortably. They had expected pleading or desperate attempts to shift blame. Sarah continued, "You speak of the attack on the Carillion Mining Collective as unprovoked aggression. You call it a violation of the Sacred Accords. You claim it represents human barbarism and our inability to live peacefully within this empire." Her voice grew stronger, more confident. "But before you pass judgment on my species, before you decide our fate based on incomplete information, I ask that you consider one crucial fact that seems to have been overlooked in your rush to condemn us." Vextar leaned forward slightly, his silver eyes narrowing. What fact could possibly justify the murder of 3,000 innocent beings? Sarah met his gaze without flinching. The fact that those innocent miners fired on our civilian transport ship first. The chamber exploded into chaos. Voices rose in dozens of different languages, all expressing shock, outrage, and disbelief. Several representatives stood and shouted accusations at Sarah, calling her a liar and worse. Vextar's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Silence!" The chamber gradually quieted, though the tension remained thick in the air. "Captain Shun, that is a serious accusation. Do you have proof of this claim?" Sarah nodded calmly. "Edo. But, more importantly, I have something else that I believe this council needs to see before making any decisions about humanity's place in your empire." She reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a small data storage device. This contains the complete sensor logs from the human transport ship Harmony, as well as communications record from our military vessels that responded to their distress call. "We have already reviewed all submitted evidence," Counselor Zelneth interjected. "No such data was provided by human authorities." "Because human authorities were never asked for it," Sarah replied simply. "This council received evidence from Carillion sources and considered it complete. No one bothered to request the human perspective on these events." The chamber fell silent again. Several counselors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Vextar's expression darkened. "Are you suggesting that this council acted improperly?" "I'm suggesting that this council acted exactly as I would expect any organization to act when it believes it already knows the truth," Sarah answered. "But the truth, honored counselors, is rarely as simple as it first appears." She held up the data device. The Harmony was a civilian transport carrying medical supplies to the Outer Rim colonies. It was unarmed and clearly marked with humanitarian identifiers according to Imperial law. When it entered the asteroid field where the Carillion operation was located, it was following established shipping lanes that had been in use for over a century. Sarah paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. The Carillion vessels immediately surrounded the Harmony and demanded it submit to boarding and inspection. When our captain asked for justification, pointing out that the ship was clearly marked as a humanitarian vessel, the Carillions opened fire. "That's impossible," shouted a voice from the Carillion section. "Our people are peaceful miners. They would never attack without provocation." Sarah turned toward the Carillion representative, a crystalline being whose form reflected the chamber's lights in rainbow patterns. "With respect, Counselor Kethvar, your people weren't mining in that asteroid field. They were strip mining a planet." The silence that followed was absolute. Strip mining inhabited worlds was one of the most serious crimes under Imperial law, punishable by complete species exile. "The planet Kepler, 442b," Sarah continued, home to a pre-industrial civilization called the Melani. The Carillion Collective had received mining rights to the asteroid field, but satellite imagery shows they had moved their operations to the planet's surface. They were harvesting the rare minerals found in the Melani's sacred burial grounds. Vextar's forearms trembled slightly. These are very serious accusations, Captain Shun." "Yes, they are," Sarah agreed. "And they explain why the Carillion vessels fired on an unarmed humanitarian transport. They couldn't afford to let word of their illegal operations reach Imperial authorities." She activated a small holographic projector, displaying images above her head for all to see. These are sensor readings from the Harmony's final minutes. You can clearly see weapons fire from Corellian vessels striking our ship first. Our transport managed to send out a distress signal before its life support failed. The images showed the unmistakable energy signatures of Corellian mining lasers being used as weapons against a much smaller human ship. Our military vessels arrived within 6 hours, Sarah continued. They found the Harmony drifting with all hands lost. 17 crew members, including 2 children who were traveling with their parents to the medical colony. The chamber remained silent, but Sarah could see the mood shifting. Doubt was creeping into the expressions of many representatives. When our ships demanded an explanation from the Corellian fleet, they were told it was a misunderstanding. The Corellians claimed they thought the Harmony was a pirate vessel. But our sensors had already detected the illegal mining operations on Kepler 442b. Sarah deactivated the hologram and looked directly at Vextar. Our military commander gave the Corellians one chance to surrender and face imperial justice for their crimes. Instead, they chose to fight. The battle that followed resulted in the destruction of 17 Corellian vessels and the deaths you've heard about today. But why? Asked Counselor Zelneth. Why did humanity not present this evidence immediately? Why allow this council to believe you were the aggressors? For the first time since entering the chamber, Sarah smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression, because we wanted to see what kind of justice the Zephyrian Empire truly offers, she said. We wanted to know if this council would seek the truth or simply accept the word of an established member species against the newcomers. The implications of her words hit the chamber like a physical blow. She was essentially accusing the entire imperial government of prejudice and incompetence. Vextar rose to his full height, his silver eyes blazing with anger. You dare suggest that this council cannot be trusted to seek justice? I suggest that this council has already demonstrated where its loyalties lie, Sarah replied calmly. You condemned an entire species based on incomplete evidence. You were prepared to punish humanity without even asking for our side of the story. You assumed we were guilty because we're young and different, and you've never trusted us anyway. The truth of her words was undeniable, and the silence in the chamber reflected the discomfort of beings who suddenly realized they had been caught in their own prejudices. Furthermore, Sarah added, while this council has been debating humanity's punishment for defending ourselves against criminals, the real perpetrators have been covering their tracks. Corellian cleanup crews have been working around the clock to eliminate evidence of their illegal mining operations. She activated her holographic projector again, showing current satellite feeds of the Kepler 442b system. As you can see, all mining equipment has been removed from the planet's surface. The Melani burial sites have been restored to look untouched. If Imperial investigators arrive now, they'll find nothing but a clean asteroid mining operation. Counselor Kethvar's crystalline form flickered rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation in his species. These images could be fabricated. They could be, Sarah agreed. Just as your sensor logs could have been altered. Just as the evidence this council accepted so readily could have been manufactured to hide the real crimes. She paused, letting the weight of that possibility settle over the assembly. But there's one piece of evidence that can't be faked or hidden, she continued. The Melani themselves. 6 weeks later, High Counselor Vextar stood before the same grand assembly, but the atmosphere in the chamber was completely different. Where before there had been unified condemnation of humanity, now there were clear divisions among the member species. The investigation had revealed truths that shook the foundation of several long-standing political alliances. The Imperial Investigation Committee has completed its review of all evidence related to the Kepler 442b incident, Vextar announced, his forearms holding data tablets containing the massive report. The findings are disturbing. Captain Sarah Chun stood in the same spot she had occupied weeks earlier, but she was no longer alone. Beside her stood Ambassador Elena Vasquez, humanity's senior diplomatic representative, and Commander James Rodriguez, who had led the military response that started this whole crisis. The evidence conclusively proves that the Carillion Mining Collective engaged in illegal strip mining operations on an inhabited world, Vextar continued. Furthermore, they deliberately destroyed settlements belonging to the native Melani population and desecrated sacred burial sites in violation of 12 separate imperial statutes. Councillor Kethvar's crystalline form had lost much of its luster over the past weeks. The investigation had uncovered not just the crimes on Kepler 442b, but a pattern of similar violations on 17 other worlds over the past century. The Carillion Collective's entire economic structure was built on a legal exploitation of pre-industrial civilizations. The committee also confirms that Carillion vessels fired first upon the human transport ship Harmony, Vextar added. All 17 crew members aboard the Harmony were killed in what can only be described as a deliberate act of murder designed to prevent Imperial authorities from learning of the Collective's crimes. A ripple of murmurs went through the chamber. Even those who had been most critical of humanity's actions were forced to admit that the evidence was overwhelming. However, Vextar's voice grew stern. The committee also concludes that humanity's military response, while understandable, exceeded the scope of lawful self-defense. The destruction of 17 Carillion vessels and the deaths of 3,000 beings represents a disproportionate use of force. Sarah had expected this conclusion. The Empire's laws were designed to prevent member species from taking unilateral military action, even in response to crimes. But she had gambled that the political consequences of the investigation would outweigh the legal technicalities. Therefore, Vextar continued, this council faces an unprecedented situation. We have clear violations of imperial law by both parties, but the circumstances surrounding these violations are extraordinary. Ambassador Vasquez stepped forward slightly. Unlike Sarah's military bearing, she projected the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating complex political situations. Honored counselors, she said, humanity acknowledges that our military response violated imperial protocols. We do not dispute the technical legality of our actions. However, we maintain that those actions were both morally justified and necessary to prevent ongoing genocide. The law exists for good reasons, Ambassador, replied Councillor Zelneth. If we excuse violations simply because the cause seems just, we undermine the entire legal framework that maintains peace among our member species. I agree completely, Vasquez said, surprising many in the chamber, which is why humanity proposes a new framework to address these exact situations in the future. She activated a holographic display showing a complex legal document. We call it the Rapid Response Protocol, she explained. It would allow any member species to request emergency authorization for humanitarian intervention when pre-industrial civilizations are threatened. The request would be reviewed by a special committee within 72 hours, with automatic approval if no response is given within that time frame. The proposal sent shockwaves through the assembly. It was a direct challenge to the Empire's traditional, slow, deliberate approach to decision-making. This protocol would also establish severe penalties for any member species that interferes with humanitarian missions or threatens civilians attempting to report crimes against pre-industrial populations, Vasquez continued. Several representatives were already studying the proposal on their personal devices. Sarah could see some nodding in approval, while others looked deeply concerned. Furthermore, Vasquez added, humanity proposes the creation of a permanent humanitarian defense force, staffed by volunteers from all member species, specifically tasked with protecting pre-industrial civilizations from exploitation. High Counselor Vextar's silver eyes were glowing brightly now. Ambassador, you're essentially asking this empire to restructure its entire approach to law enforcement and military intervention. Yes, we are, Vasquez replied without hesitation. Because the current system failed the Melani completely. It would have failed countless other civilizations if humanity hadn't acted. And if this council rejects your proposal, ask Counselor Zelneth. Sarah stepped forward again, her voice carrying across the vast chamber. Then, humanity will withdraw from the Empire and establish our own protocols for protecting innocent civilizations from predators like the Carillion Collective. The threat was even more explicit than before, but this time Sarah wasn't alone in making it. The Altarian Trade Union supports humanity's proposal, announced their representative. We have discovered evidence of similar crimes in our own territories that went uninvestigated for decades. The Vorlian Confederation also supports these reforms, added another voice. Our military stands ready to contribute to any humanitarian defense force. More voices joined in support, creating a growing coalition that surprised even Sarah. The investigation had revealed that the problems on Kepler 442b were just the tip of a much larger iceberg of corruption and exploitation within the Empire. But not everyone was convinced. "This is madness," declared Councillor Mordag of the ancient Xyrillian Empire. "We cannot restructure millennia of legal tradition based on one incident, no matter how tragic." One incident? Sarah's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. The investigation found evidence of systematic exploitation on 43 different worlds. Over the past century, an estimated 500,000 pre-industrial beings have died as a direct result of crimes that imperial authorities failed to investigate or prevent. The number hit the chamber like a physical blow. Even those who opposed the reforms couldn't argue with the mathematics of genocide. These deaths occur because the current system prioritizes procedure over protection, Sarah continued. Because bureaucratic process is considered more important than sentient lives. Because some species are considered more valuable than others. She gestured toward the Carillion section, where Councillor Kethvar sat in disgrace. The Carillion Collective committed these crimes because they knew the Empire wouldn't act quickly enough to stop them. They counted on imperial procedures to give them time to cover their tracks. And they were right, Commander Rodriguez added, speaking for the first time during the proceedings. If humanity hadn't acted immediately, all evidence of their crimes would have been destroyed. The Melani would have been extinct within months, and no one would have ever known they existed. The chamber fell silent as the weight of that possibility settled over the assembly. High Counselor Vextar looked around the chamber, taking in the faces of hundreds of representatives from across the galaxy. The political landscape had shifted dramatically over the past weeks. The old order was crumbling, and something new was emerging to take its place. The Council will now vote, he announced. First, on the question of sanctions against the Carillion Collective for their proven crimes against the Melani civilization and the murder of human civilians. The vote was overwhelming. Every species except the Carillions themselves voted for the harshest possible sanctions, including immediate suspension from the Empire and criminal prosecution of their leadership. Second, Vextar continued, on the question of sanctions against humanity for violation of imperial military protocols. This vote was much closer, but ultimately the Council voted for a formal censure rather than serious punishment. The political reality was that too many species now supported humanity's position to make harsh penalties practical. Finally, Vextar said, on humanity's proposed rapid response protocol and the establishment of a humanitarian defense force. Sarah held her breath. This was the moment that would determine the future of the Empire and possibly the future of humanity's place in it. The vote began with the senior member species. The ancient Xyrillian Empire voted against the proposal, as expected. But, to everyone's surprise, the Thessarian Dominion voted in favor. The Vorlian Confederation and Altarian Trade Union followed suit. As the votes continued, it became clear that something historic was happening. Species that had never cooperated before were uniting behind a common cause. The newer members of the Empire were being joined by older civilizations who had grown frustrated with the status quo. When the final tally was announced, the Rapid Response Protocol had passed by a margin of 71%. The chamber erupted in a mixture of celebration and outrage. Some representatives cheered, while others stormed out in protest. The Empire was splitting along lines that hadn't existed just 2 months earlier. High Counselor Vextar raised all 4 arms for silence, and gradually the chaos subsided. The Rapid Response Protocol is hereby adopted as imperial law, he announced. The Humanitarian Defense Force will be established within 6 months, with contributions from all willing member species. He turned to look directly at Sarah. Captain Shun, your species came before this council accused of unprovoked aggression. You leave here as the architects of the most significant reform in imperial history. Sarah nodded respectfully. We came here to defend our actions, honored counselor. But, more importantly, we came here to defend the principle that all sentient life has value, regardless of technology level or political representation. And you have succeeded, Vextar admitted. Though I suspect the empire you helped create today will be very different from the one your species joined 23 years ago. Different can be better, Sarah replied. The Melani are still alive because we believe that. Countless other civilizations will remain alive because this council chose to believe it too. As the formal session ended and representatives began filing out of the chamber, Sarah found herself surrounded by delegates from dozens of different species. Many wanted to discuss details of the new protocols. Others wanted to volunteer their species' resources for the Humanitarian Defense Force. But it was Elder Shindal's holographic message, transmitted from Kepler 442b, that meant the most to her. The soft-skinned sky beings have kept their promise, the Melani leader said, his golden fur bright in his world's sunlight. Justice has come to our people, and our ancestors can rest in peace knowing their sacred places are protected. He held up his ceremonial staff, which Sarah now realized was carved not from bone, but from a piece of rare mineral that the Carillions had been mining. My people have voted to grant mining rights for this sacred mineral to the soft-skinned sky beings, Elder Shindal continued. Not because they demanded it, but because they earned it through honor and sacrifice. The stones will be freely given to those who prove themselves worthy. Sarah smiled. The Melani's gesture was worth more than all the political victories combined. It proved that doing the right thing, even when it meant breaking rules and risking everything, could lead to outcomes better than anyone imagined. Ambassador Vasquez joined her as they watched the last of Elder Shindal's message. Think this will work? Vasquez asked quietly. Sarah looked around the chamber at the representatives still arguing about implementation details, at the species already forming alliances around humanitarian principles, at the fundamental transformation taking place in galactic politics. It has to, she said simply, because if it doesn't, we'll just have to find another way. And if the Empire tries to stop us, Sarah's smile grew wider. Then they'll discover that humans don't just fight for themselves. We fight for anyone who needs defending, regardless of what the rules say about it. As they left the chamber together, Sarah couldn't help but think about how it had all started with a simple humanitarian transport carrying medical supplies to colonists who needed help. The Empire had tried to condemn humanity for defending that mission, but in the end, it had learned something important about the newest members of its galactic community. When someone struck first against the innocent, humans would always strike back. But more than that, they would make sure the galaxy became a place where such strikes were no longer possible. The silence that had fallen over the Empire when the crisis began had been broken forever. In its place rose a new voice, speaking for all those who had been voiceless before. And at the center of that voice was a simple principle that humanity had brought to the stars. Everyone deserved protection. Everyone deserved justice. Everyone deserved to be heard. And if you struck first against those principles, you would discover that humans had very long memories and very strong convictions about making things right. 6 weeks later, High Counselor Vextar stood before the same Grand Assembly, but the atmosphere in the chamber was completely different. Where before there had been unified condemnation of humanity, now there were clear divisions among the member species. The investigation had revealed truths that shook the foundation of several long-standing political alliances. The Imperial Investigation Committee has completed its review of all evidence related to the Kepler 442b incident, Vextar announced, his four arms holding data tablets containing the massive report. The findings are disturbing. Captain Sarah Chun stood in the same spot she had occupied weeks earlier, but she was no longer alone. Beside her stood Ambassador Elena Vasquez, humanity's senior diplomatic representative, and Commander James Rodriguez, who had led the military response that started this whole crisis. The evidence conclusively proves that the Carillion Mining Collective engaged in illegal strip mining operations on an inhabited world, Vextar continued. Furthermore, they deliberately destroyed settlements belonging to the native Melani population and desecrated sacred burial sites in violation of 12 separate imperial statutes. Councillor Kethvar's crystalline form had lost much of its luster over the past weeks. The investigation had uncovered not just the crimes on Kepler 442b, but a pattern of similar violations on 17 other worlds over the past century. The Carillion Collective's entire economic structure was built on illegal exploitation of pre-industrial civilizations. The committee also confirms that Carillion vessels fired first upon a human transport ship Harmony, Vextar added. All 17 crew members aboard the Harmony were killed in what can only be described as a deliberate act of murder designed to prevent Imperial authorities from learning of the Collective's crimes. A ripple of murmurs went through the chamber. Even those who had been most critical of humanity's actions were forced to admit that the evidence was overwhelming. However, Vextar's voice grew stern. The committee also concludes that humanity's military response, while understandable, exceeded the scope of lawful self-defense. The destruction of 17 Carillion vessels and the deaths of 3,000 beings represents a disproportionate use of force. Sarah had expected this conclusion. The Empire's laws were designed to prevent member species from taking unilateral military action, even in response to crimes. But she had gambled that the political consequences